Here with Caroline Roberts, who will be Dr. Caroline Roberts by next week. Is that right?
Yeah, very soon.
And you're at the University of Minnesota with Dr. Symons, who's very well known in the field of intellectual disability and self-injury. And we met, so if I just introduce us a little bit of how we met, and then I'll get you to introduce yourself, Caroline. So we met because we write on similar topics. And I think you cited one of my research papers, which I always get excited about. And then when I got to read your research paper, it was specifically about thinking about people with intellectual disabilities who self-injure within the context of their families. And you were really very deliberately bringing over research from mainstream literature into self-injury and applying it to those with intellectual disabilities, which is kind of what I spend a lot of time doing as well.
Oh, it's cool to meet another person doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your focus?
Yeah. So I'm Caroline. I like to start by saying that I have my lived experience in self-injury. That's how I got into this. My brother Benjamin has intellectual and developmental disabilities, and he has self-injured for most of his life. So I really bring my sister experience into my research. And so I have just finished my PhD in educational psychology at the University of Minnesota. And most of my research has really been this deliberate trying to bridge the gap of self-injury in people with IDD and without. And so you found one of those papers, the one about families and really taking a family-centered approach, which is something we don't often do in people with IDD. So yeah.
So I guess we're a couple of the few numbers of people who are in this space where we're thinking about self-injury, not from a behavioural, biological approach alone, but also thinking about what role emotional overwhelm and adverse experiences has for a young person who's self-injuring.
Yeah, so I just find that, in non-suicidal self-injury and people without IDD, that's so often a lot of the conversation is emotion and trauma and all these kind of developmental psychology variables. And so why can't we take some of what we know from that literature and apply it? That's what I was trying to do with this family therapy paper.
So can you say a little bit before I get into your paper, like why do you think that's been such a problem? So like you and I are both trying to take mainstream ideas about self-injury and self-harm and apply them to people with intellectual disabilities. And this is not only rare, it's also controversial. And we were talking just before about the people that we sometimes encounter who get very angry about this and say, no, it's a behavior or it's a result of diagnosis, and it becomes almost offensive to them that we're considering these roles of trauma and emotional overwhelm. How have we got here? What do you think that's about?
I've been wondering that so much myself. I sort of like to think about the history, like the history of science, especially from the US context of kind of deinstitutionalization in the US is really not that long ago. So if you think about, if you think about kind of the role of people with disabilities in society broadly and how that trickles into the way we do our science and the way that we have our clinical care, I think that has a lot to do with how kind of siloed our care and our research has become. So the way I'm thinking about it, we have this long history of separating people with disabilities. And that has led to separate research, separate care. And so, of course, over time, that leads to separate conceptualizations of behavior and self-injury in particular. So I'm really trying to like counteract that. So I think the basis of it is like history and attitudes.
Absolutely.
Societal attitudes about disability.
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the barriers that you and I come across a lot in research, which is probably going to sound crazy to somebody in like the general population, is that if you take an idea that's well established in the general population, like the idea that adverse experiences and overwhelming emotion can
Mhm.
be called a causal factor for self-harm, and you say, well, and then again, and in our field, it's true that that's also established for those with mild or moderate learning disabilities and
Mhm.
intellectual disabilities. And then you say, well, we're going to assume that that's also true for somebody with a severe intellectual disability. Maybe he's someone who can't speak. Then the research community will say, you can't assume, you have to evidence it. And if you
Mhm.
don't evidence it, then we have to assume it isn't true. And for us, this feels upside down because why? Like, what is it that's so different for someone with a severe intellectual disability
Yeah.
that means that something we know is true for humanity as a whole would not be true for them? Like,
Mhm.
so we get accused of like, you're making assumptions, but it feels like there's a much deeper assumption that for someone with a severe intellectual disability, ordinary received wisdom and evidenced based understanding does not apply unless you
Mhm.
can evidence it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what you were saying earlier, that we don't do that for any other group. It would be absurd to do that for another group.
Yeah,
That's such an interesting comparison.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I was very much trained in my PhD program that what you observe, what you can measure, is what you do your science on,
yes,
because we don't want to be making assumptions. And and I think to some extent that's useful, that's scientific method. But when you're thinking about something like someone's trauma experience and they're nonverbal and they can't articulate to you,
yeah,
this is what I've experienced,
yeah,
there's definitely use to say, yes, that might be there, and we can use that um, in our clinical care without having to measure it, without having to know in this kind of behavioral measure observational scale where it falls.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So I guess, the sorts of conversations we're having and the research that we're putting out is pushing back against
Hmm.
um, a couple of 100 years. I mean, it's not always been like this, right? We're talking
Yeah.
segregation started in the 1800s, institutionalization started in well, it's not always been around, but we're pushing back against a couple 100 years or more of this idea that if somebody
Hmm.
has a severe intellectual disability, they are fundamentally different from the rest of
Hmm.
humanity. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. That's a big push.
yeah.
But I'm glad I found someone else who's doing it. It's very cool to connect with someone else who's like thinking like I am.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's and there's what I tend to find is there's far more advocates in the sort of lived experience world,
Yeah.
whether that's family members like yourself or practitioners,
Hmm.
than there is in the research space because we have to accept that institutionalization was bolstered by the research community for years,
Hmm.
as much as anything else. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I found sort of coming to grad school and kind of integrating my lived experience with academia and the way that we do research was a very interesting process
yeah.
for that reason, because I often had to sort of navigate the way that my experiences were butting up against the way that research is done, which led me to, doing questions like this that are really intentionally counteracting the way things have been done before.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah.
let me ask you a little bit about your paper, which I absolutely loved, and is
Thank you.
about the role that um the impact of the family
Hmm.
around the person who is self-injuring. So you talk about this assumption that again is very reasonable, which is the idea that if there's an individual who's self-injuring in the family group, it will impact on the family as a whole, but also
Hmm.
that the family as a whole will be impacting on the individual's self-injury. So we have this like systems
Hmm.
interaction. And this is a completely reasonable idea. It's well established in all sorts of different fields of research and emotional health, including self-injury. But it's not the way that we've treated self-injury for somebody with intellectual disabilities, really ever. In fact, it's the first paper I've ever read about the role of the family in and on somebody's self-injury if they have intellectual disabilities. So it's far more common that we see the self-injury as existing inside of the individual, and that we need to fix the individual, and then it will bring a relief to the family. And I think a lot about, there's some amazing units, neurobehavioral units or intervention units that will take a child out of their family, will work really hard on a behavioural plan, and then when the child is settled again, will pop them back into the family. And I'm not saying that sometimes that's needed, sometimes it's really important, sometimes it works really well, but it's still based on the idea that the child that is holding the problem rather than it being interactional.
Yeah.
So can you just speak to that for a bit, Caroline?
Yeah,
You say,
absolutely.
well, like why you think that's where that's come from, those ideas.
Yeah. Like you said, I'd never encountered a paper like this before either, and that's why I felt the need to write it. This really came out of being in the family social science space. So I minored in family science, and was learning all about family systems theory and the interactions of different members of the family and how that influences bidirectionally. And there's no family therapy interventions for self-injury and IDD. That's just does not exist. And like you said, it's because we think about it on this individual level, or we think about it as sort of caregiver and the individual, like kind of behavioral contingencies between the two.
Yeah.
If there's a social function of the behavior, say. And so I think there's so much opportunity to think about family context and support both the individual and their family at the family level. That's just, we're missing that opportunity entirely, right? And that can really help us get at, if someone is not able to self-report, not able to talk about their feelings, we have the opportunity to use all their family members as therapeutic tools, and we're not doing that, right? And so the way I decided to sort of try to enter that space is by using all the existing literature we have on non-suicidal self-injury in people without disabilities, because there's a huge field of literature on family therapy interventions in this population. And as we were saying earlier, my base assumption is, why wouldn't that apply when someone has intellectual disabilities? There might be adjustments we need to make, and I talk about that in the paper. But if we start from a base of we're all humans and we all have this shared humanity, we can start by applying that literature rather than, assuming it's not going to fit. And so I reviewed what we know about family therapy in non-suicidal self-injury, and then I pulled out some really key translational opportunities, ways that we can use that literature to start to think about how would we do family therapy, how would we use the family system as a tool to support someone who has self-injury and intellectual and developmental disabilities. And there was so much opportunity there. I think, just starting to think about emotion was one of the most based ideas, because we rarely do. And in your work in trauma, that is so key to what's going on there. And so, when a teenager is cutting, it's very common to say, she's overwhelmed emotionally and she doesn't know how to cope otherwise.
Right.
That's very frequently the assumption on that side of the literature. But what if we bring that idea into IDD, and are able to think about the emotional states of that individual? And how does that relate to their attachment with their caregiver? That was another thing that really came up, especially thinking about the family lens, is we know that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are more likely to have insecure attachments.
Mm.
And yet we're not thinking about attachment theory and caregiver attachment in SIB. It's harder to measure. I think that's one reason that a lot of this isn't considered, is that as researchers, we want to be able to take these objective measures of what's going on. And that's often very difficult in this population.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, but I think what I was found really interesting when I just reread your paper again this morning is that you can totally imagine how a kind of formal family therapy would be helpful for a family with it trying to support a young person with, you know, maybe very entrenched self-injury. But actually, there's also some quite simple tools that you could even just bring into like a coaching or an information session for families. And it reminded me of some of the even just informal conversations we've had with families or with caregivers, um, uh, like very simple things like noticing or wondering about the emotion that the person is experiencing when they enter into self-injuries. Like, I remember a team we worked with a while back, and when the child they were supporting would begin to hurt himself, they just took a moment to like check in with themselves and with him and think, what's the overwhelming emotion in this moment? And then they would just, so before they went into restraint or before they went into like trying to support him, they just named it. So they would say, I wonder if you're feeling anxious, or I wonder if you're feeling angry. And this consistently helped him quite quickly to stop hurting himself, because he had a word for what he was feeling that was overwhelming him, and he could see that the person supporting him was trying to share it and to validate it. And I remember another partner, just a really small, like tiny intervention that we made was the family. So oftentimes when they would drop him to school, they would have had a terrible time in the morning with him. Like, you know, school runs are notoriously stressful, and getting any child ready for school in the morning is notoriously stressful. And they had gotten into a habit when they handed him over to his support worker, that they would just say over his head, he's had a terrible morning. Maybe they would say that he'd hurt himself or the things that he'd done. And we just did this tiny intervention because we were like, we appreciate that you as parents need to tell someone because you've had a terrible time and you need to be able to say, I've had an awful morning. But could you just wait until your son has gone out of earshot? And we arranged for one of the support workers to stay behind just for 5 minutes and listen to the morning that they'd had, but that he no longer had to hear it. And that, you know, you talk about the role of criticism, of like, you know, in family therapy, so often one of the interventions is just helping a parent to move away from leveling criticism at the child, because sometimes children internalize that as shame. And the literature is really clear about this. And for them, they were just giving the facts of what was happening, but we don't know, but we have to assume that there's a risk that he was internalizing that as shameful, particularly if he has 5 mornings in a row where the first thing that is said to his support worker is how terrible he's been that morning. Like almost like, how can he not internalize that as shameful?
Wow.
And then so it wasn't family therapy, it was just 2 really small tweaks in the care. One, not verbalizing like criticism over his head, or listing the things that had gone wrong in his day. And 2, just noticing the emotion that was attending the self-injury and just naming it. They're not big things. They don't take teams of therapists, but they're straight out of the family therapy literature.
Yeah, I love that, because I've been thinking about this long term as, how do we develop an intervention and implement it, and implementation science of a family therapy intervention. And that's such a nice example of how it doesn't need to be this big intervention with every member of the family there. You can take these ideas and apply them in really small but impactful ways.
Yeah. Yeah, and you also talk about the aspect of family therapy that talks about this sort of whether families have enmeshed relations or distance relations,
Yes.
or how that. And I just thought about so many families that I've worked with that have either often just to defend themselves emotionally from their child's self-injury, either massively distanced themselves emotionally or have become so enmeshed with the child that they can't feel where they end and the child begins. And both of these are really damaging to relationships. These like two ends of the spectrum, aren't they? And I think it's not a huge job to just begin to talk about that, isn't it? And to think about the boundary and where it should be, and working that, helping families to reconsider that again.
Well, and I like how you're conceptualizing this as not just about supporting the individual with IED, but their caregivers, their parents, their siblings, anyone in their family as well. And that's another thing that's nice about the family-centered approach is it's very challenging to be a caregiver for someone engaging in these behaviors. And we also want to support you and what you're going through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that sometimes can do damage to this for the child is that because caregivers can become aware that maybe a child has associated anxiety with the absence of their family, they make the decision never to talk about family. So if the child, I've noticed it a little bit. If the child asks about family, they'll maybe say something short and they'll move it on because they'll be like, well, I can't bring mum in. Like he's asking about mum, but mum isn't here, so I'll just move it on. But actually, most children spend a good amount of time talking about family when they're not there. And just not, it doesn't mean that the child has to see mum or dad, but that ordinary conversation of like, where's mummy now? Mummy's at work, and you'll see her at the end of the day. Like these conversations aren't as common with somebody who's non-speaking. And I've in my own research, I noticed that even older, all of my participants were over the age of 16. And there was some anxiety about where their families were, like just where were they in the world? Because no one would talk to them about it.
Well, that's very normal for a secure attachment.
Yeah.
I mean, that's straight out of the attachment literature is this is someone, my attachment figure, and I want to know where they are.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And just the only conversation that often carers would have with either mum and dad are here or they're not here, but they weren't prepared to have the conversation, where are they now? Like,
Right.
they still
And
exist
I
in the
even,
world. They've not,
gosh,
and I think those pieces of work as well, they feel scary to carers, I think.
I
But
even think about, I wrote a little bit in my paper about ways that attachment might look a little bit different when someone has a severe intellectual disability. And one way was object permanence. Like the idea that you don't necessarily, like your awareness of something that's not right in front of you might be different if you have an intellectual disability. So then I would expect so much anxiety around where is mom? If she's not here, where is she? Is she okay? So it's almost another element, an added layer of, yes, of course we should talk about this and assure you and hope to ease the anxiety through that.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I really wonder about, the object permanence, particularly of young people with severe intellectual disabilities. But the thing about object permanence is it's learnt. None of us are born with object permanence.
Yeah, good point.
We learn it through conversation. How does a mum teach the child who's in that stage that the child doesn't want her to leave the room? So mum does this thing, mums and dads do this thing where they talk to the child from the other room. They say, I'm not in the room, you can't see me, but I'm still here. And or they say to the child who goes to nursery, I'm not coming with you, but you can look after my scarf for the day, and I'm going to come back and get it at the end of the day. These kinds of objects of transference. they're really ordinary ways of helping a child to develop object permanence. And I think there's no reason why we can't at least do the work with somebody who's non-speaking, that there is a way, they can learn it too. It's a developmental track that we learn through teaching and experience. It's not innate. We're not born with it. I think of a young man I used to work with who was deaf and blind, and his dad used to ring every night, and he never knew that he rang. And so we developed a system with his dad where he would always, when he saw his dad would always wear the same aftershave. He had to stock up because he'll have to wear it for the rest of his life now.
Yeah.
His dad always liked to wear a tie. So we said to Dad, can you give us a couple of your ties and a bottle of the aftershave? And so we would spray the tie with the aftershave, and every time that Dad rang, we would give it to his son. Yeah. And then sign Daddy, so that he knew that he was thinking about him. And what I loved about that was over time, he was like early pubescent. He was probably about 12 or 13 when we started this, and he began to have a very classic adolescent response to this. So sometimes he would snuggle the tie for ages, and sometimes he would take it to bed, and sometimes he would throw it across the room.
I love that. Wow.
And it felt like really nice in action of like, of the struggle of loss and attachment, like an order playing out of like, well, where is he? I don't want the tie today. I want him, and I'm cross with him for not being here.
Yeah.
Other days he'd be like, oh, I know, he's thinking about me. I'm going to take. Yeah, it was really beautiful.
That's really sweet. My brother lives in a different state from me, and he's also deafblind. Well, he's not entirely deaf. So my usual approach is on FaceTime, I'll just kind of yell and hope that he knows that I'm there. But I like this idea of some kind of smell or object cue that he can associate with me like that.
Yeah. I guess that that attachment piece, you're right, it is complicated with someone with severe intellectual disabilities, and it's hard to measure, but I feel like there's still ways that we can help a person to build it, to feel more secure in their relationships.
Yes, well, that's such a beautiful example. It takes creativity, sometimes a lot of aftershave, but there are ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting to talk to you about these
it's really refreshing for me to talk to someone with clinical experience, because I've been very much in the research space for a while, and haven't had as much interaction working directly with families. So it's nice to know there are ways that you're able to apply these ideas that are working for people and making sense.
So maybe I'll just ask you, as we're coming into land, like so you looked at a whole pile of different family interventions and family systems interventions. Of all of the ones that you wrote about, what do you think would be most effective, or what do you think was what can you sort of imagine being applied into a family supporting somebody who self-injures?
Yeah, I don't know that I can pinpoint like one intervention and say this is the one, because we have so little, we haven't applied so many elements from just broadly families. So, I could say emotionally focused family therapy, but we have almost no emotionally focused research on this. So it's hard to know what that would look like and how it would work. And I think there's a lot of work to do still. But I think just the little elements from a lot of them, taking elements from emotion, taking elements from attachment, from family cohesion and communication, little ways that we can apply those with families, I think is a start. And also, each clinician can individualize and pull from a lot of different types of approaches for a family.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just have to keep being creative, don't we? And pulling things also, and I often think, you know, when we begin maybe to work with a new individual or a new family or a team, I think of it as this pulling in of like multiple different ideas around the individual and their circle of support, and just trying to be as creative as we can,
Yeah.
pulling different disciplines, different ideas from multiple
Yes.
fields to find something that's going to fit, and not being narrow in not being, you know,
Yeah.
not being just caught in one
Prescribed.
discipline or one way of thinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think, you know, pulling broader than just this is what we know about people with intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities.
Yeah.
You know, we know so much about 12-year-olds generally,
Yeah.
right? And what can we learn from this massive adolescent developmental literature that might apply? And this 12-year-old happens to have a disability, but that doesn't mean that this world of intervention research won't apply.
You know that what you're saying is like, it's so reasonable, but
Hmm.
but you would make some researchers livid right now.
Oh, I know. I look forward to the YouTube comments. I know. It
I
is, and
agree
that,
though.
yeah, that's what was interesting. I've been reflecting a lot on my PhD since I'm finishing it, and what's been so interesting about it is my research comes from a place of just being naive. I came to I came to academia and I was like, why aren't we looking at this whole other side of research literature in our field? I study self-injury, and this person across the university in clinical psychology also studies self-injury.
Yeah,
We've never met, we've never talked.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Same for
Um,
me.
yeah, and that's really what led to this work and this way of thinking. Is just why are we doing it this way? I don't understand.
Yeah, yeah, it's so good. And it's often those, like finding the right question and asking from that place of
Hmm.
curiosity that brings about a fresh way forward and a fresh approach, isn't it?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
and maybe can I ask you, like, just before we finish, like, because you're coming at this from a research lens, but you're also coming at this as we started the conversation, you talked about being a sister,
Hmm.
to your brother who is, you know, living with some of these realities. So, what would you want to say to another family member who is, you know,
Yeah,
has a family member has intellectual disabilities and is
yeah.
thinking themselves?
That's a great question, and I appreciate being asked that question. I think as a sister, it's so deeply complex, my relationship with my brother and my family. And there are really hard things and there are really wonderful things. And every family has their own story like that,
Yeah,
right? And so the more I try to bring in other perspectives and think critically and examine my assumptions, all of that is coming from a place of I really want to honor the complexity of your humanity and your experience,
yeah,
because I have my own and I know how deeply complex that is and how wonderful and challenging it is at the same time. So I think my message is just, you know, that's why I'm doing this. I'm trying to to honor your lived experience in that way because I really think research and clinical care can do better in that way.
yeah. So good. Great note to end on.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Caroline.